What's up? How we doing? Give me a sec. My audio's fucked up. This is fucked up. I have to adjust this every other time I use my microphone for anything. It's very, very annoying. All right, you should be able to hear me now. We'll give people about maybe 5 minutes to show up, and then we'll get started. Yeah, so we'll give some people time to roll in. But yeah, so basically, I'm usually off. I sectioned my off day to be Mondays. So it's basically a 2-3 schedule. So meaning, fuck. All right, meaning 2 days on, 3 days on. So 1-2 off, 1-2-3 off. But I found that there's a need for certain things that currently don't exist on Twitch. So what I want to try to do is kind of fill that void a little bit. So what we're going to try to do over the off days in March is to do certain reads of things that I think are essential. Not really, yeah, essential reads. And I figured, like, what better way to use this new backdrop that I created than to use that time in doing those certain type of reads. So if there's something that I think what's up, Gio? If it's something that I think needs to be read and think something that we need to go over, I'm gonna go over it in its entirety, as opposed to sort of, I guess the read meme, I guess you'd say. So as an example, I guess to give you some context as to what we're doing, or what we're going to be doing over the next couple of weeks, is usually my arguments are going to come from somewhere, right? So when I say arguments, there's going to be something that I may have seen online that people are just not participating in content wise, right? So how did I get here? Or how did we get here today? We can start from there, and then we'll start in a minute. So I was on Twitter, minding my business, as usual, just on Twitter, minding my business, and I stumbled upon I stumbled upon this, which was a tweet about a fun and productive conversation and debate over $15 minimum wage with Ro Kanana, who he's the 21st rep in California. Sorry, excuse me, 21st rep. He's like, I think in the 17th district in California or something like that. And then in Ben Shapiro's comments, it's just a bunch of I feels arguments about the minimum wage. There's a bunch of very good content and materials about most, if not all, bills that exist in the House, especially when they're on committee. And what happens is, in this case, for the Raise the Wage Act, there was a analysis by the CBO. For those of you who don't know, the CBO is the Congressional Budget Office. So they did an analysis of this, which was in February 2021. And something that I am very much, I guess, sensitized over is the idea that people aren't going to read these things. And then what happens is when people don't read these things, there's a lot of, I don't know if it's misinformation. I don't know what the best word is currently, but there's definitely a lot of problems that seem to arise. And what I want to try to do is break that cycle. Break the cycle of not reading, what's up, comrade? Not reading studies and whatnot. I want people to be more educated on just things, right? So what we're going to do tonight is, it's going to be only content that we're going to do tonight. So I'm going to do a single piece of content on my off days, which are going to be Mondays and Thursdays. And we're just going to read something and get through it. And this actually is probably going to be a good repurposing for this backdrop, right? So I'll use this backdrop in order to do certain reads. So when you're looking at the VODs, if you see this as the primary backdrop, there's going to be some type of read in the VOD. So with that being said, it's 9:57. We are going to get started. So this is the budgetary effects of the Raise the Wage Act of 2021. Let's get to it. 17 pages. Pretty straightforward, but we'll give it a whirl. Let me know how volume is, by the way. I'll keep tabs on it and all that good stuff. If you have questions, this isn't going to be like a read and then bounce. This is still going to be like an interactive space. So if you have questions or something sticks out in your head, or as we go along, feel free to come in and say something, obviously. If enacted at the end of March 2021, the Raise the Wage Act, S53, as introduced on January 26, 2021, would raise the federal minimum wage in annual increments to $15 per hour by June 2025, and then adjust it to increase at the same rate as median hourly wages. In this report, the Congressional Budget Office estimates the bill's effects on the federal budget. The cumulative budget deficit is over the 2021 to 2031 period would increase by $54 billion. Increases in the annual deficit will be smaller before 2025, as the minimum wage increases were being phased in than in later years. Higher prices for goods and services stemming from higher wages of workers paid at or near the minimum wage, such as providing long-term health care, would contribute to increases in federal spending. Changes in unemployment and in the distribution of income would increase spending for some programs, such as unemployment compensation, reduce spending for others, such as nutrition programs, and boost federal revenues on net. Those estimates are consistent with the CBO's conventional approach to estimating the costs of legislation. In particular, they incorporate the assumption that nominal gross domestic product, GDP, would be unchanged. As a result, total increase is roughly unchanged. Also, the deficit estimate presented above does not include increases in net overlays for interest on federal debt, as projected under current law. That would stem from the estimated effects of higher interest rates and changes in inflation under the bill. Those interest costs would add $16 billion to the deficit from 2021 to 2031. The estimates in this report are based on the CBO's most recent economic forecast, which was released earlier this month. CBO estimated the budgetary effects using techniques that it has developed over the past years. Those estimates are based on CBO's estimates of the bill's effects on the economic behavior in individuals and firms, which this report refers to actions that change relative prices, the distribution of income, unemployment, and other economic factors. Underlying the budgetary estimates are CBO's projections of how pay would change for people directly and potentially affected by an increase in the minimum wage. That is, people who would otherwise have been paid hourly wages that were less than the proposed new minimum or slightly above it. and how changes in pay would affect the number of people employed. By 2021 to 2031, the cumulative pay of affected people would increase on net by $333 billion, an increased labor cost for firms considerably larger than the net effect on the budget deficit during that period. The net increase would result in higher pay, $509 billion, for people who were employed at higher hourly wages under the bill, offset by lower pay, $175 billion, because of reduced employment under the bill. In an average week of 2025, the year when the minimum wage would reach $15 per hour, 17 million workers whose wages would otherwise be below $15 per hour would be directly affected, and many of the 10 million workers whose wages would otherwise be slightly above the rate would also be affected. At that time, the effects on workers and their families would include the following. Employment would be reduced by 1.4 million workers, or 0.9%, according to CBO's average estimate, and the number of people in poverty would be reduced by 0.9 million. This report provides the following details about the bill and the CBO's estimates on its effects on federal spending and revenues. Background on the Raise the Wage Act of 2021, effects on spending of major healthcare programs, unemployment compensation, Social Security, nutrition programs, other mandatory spending, revenues, discriminatory outlays of wages of federal workers, spending for interest surrounding the budgetary estimates, and how the CBO's analysis of budgetary effects has changed. The report also provides the following information about changes in economic behavior underlining those estimates and about CBO's analytical methods. Effects on unemployment, wages of unaffected workers, distribution of family income, real inflated adjustment output, prices, distribution of labor and capital income, interest rates, CBO's economic modeling approach, and comparisons with CBO's July 2019 analysis. Were you a bigger Walter Mondale or Antonin Scalia person? In other words, who would you rather meet? Neither. Once again, feel free to check out this VOD if you miss at any point of this read. I'll make sure this is saved. I might end up putting this on YouTube, to be honest with you, but we'll see how it goes. Background on the Raise the Wage Act of 2021. In this report, CBO analyzes the Raise the Wage Act of 2021 as introduced in the Senate on January 26, 2021. It would take effect on the first day of the third month after the date of enactment. If it was enacted at the end of March 2021, the minimum wage would increase by a set amount each year starting in June 2021 until it reached $15 an hour in July 2025. See Table 1 on page 15. In subsequent years, it would increase by the annual percentage increase, if any, in the median hourly wage of all employees. The bill's provisions would cover most low-wage workers, but they would cover not the self-employed, casual babysitters, and certain seasonal workers. The bill would also increase the minimum wage for teenagers and disabled workers, and it would increase the share of minimum wage for tipped workers that must be paid by their employers. The minimum wage for those workers has long been different from the minimum wage of other workers. Tipped workers are those whose compensation depends primarily on tips. Effects on spending for major healthcare programs. The Raise the Wage Act of 2021 would affect spending for the major federal health care programs. Some of the effects would involve workers employed in the home health care and nursing care industries. CBO projects that if current laws did not change, there would be roughly 3 million such workers by 2025, many of whom would earn less than $15 per hour. Federal programs such as Medicaid and Medicare pay for much of the care supplied by those industries. The effects of increases in the prices of healthcare stemming from higher minimum wage is a key factor contributing to an increase in spending for those programs. The effect of changes in the distribution of income is another key factor. Those changes would be downward pressure on spending the Medicaid and increased spending for marketplace subsidies. Medicare and CHIP. Under the bill, Medicare spending would increase because the effects of increases in the price of healthcare services and increases in enrollment by people who would be jobless as a result of the minimum wage increase would outweigh the effects of decreases in enrollment by people with higher income. See Table 2 on page 16. Prices, such as those for long-term services and supports and medical services, would increase as a result of negotiations that accounted for higher costs of labor facing healthcare providers. The number of Medicaid enrollees would tend to rise because of increased enrollment among people who lost employment as a result of the minimum wage increase and thus become eligible for the program. However, that tendency would be more than offset as the income of some enrollees rose above the thresholds for Medicaid eligibility, causing overall enrollment to decline. I can't just say we've raised the minimum wage. It has to say 9,000 lines of red tape. Yeah. Marketplace subsidies. A minimum wage increase would boost federal subsidies for health insurance offered through the marketplace and the basic health program. Some of the people whose wages increased under the bill would be in lower income families that, as their income increased, gained eligibility for tax credits to cover part of their premiums. People and families whose income is below 100% or 400% the federal poverty guidelines are generally eligible for those tax credits. That change in income and eligibility would cause net increases in enrollment and health insurance and in the number of people claiming premium tax credits to purchase that coverage. Some people who would be ineligible for Medicaid because of increases in their income would use those tax credits instead, offsetting some of the reduction in spending that would stem from declines in Medicaid enrollment. These tax credits are refundable and they affect revenues as well as outlays. The revenue effects are included in the revenue totals discussed below. Medicare. The higher minimum wage would increase Medicare spending, but Medicare's payment rates for healthcare providers would be higher, in contrast to Medicaid payments, which are a result of negotiations among states, providers, and managed care insurance companies. Many Medicare payments are calculated by taking base payment rates and updating them each year according to a set statutory formulas. Those updates depend in turn on the value of various economic variables, such as price indexes. A higher minimum wage would change some of those variables, resulting in increased spending. Joe, to get those tax credits, you have to pay tax agents $400 to do the paperwork because normal folks don't know the tax codes. That's a good point. Maybe somebody who does a deeper analysis of this might bring that up. That's a good point. Effects on spending for unemployment compensation. Spending for unemployment compensation would increase under the bill because more workers would be unemployed. That increase would be partially offset when states increased their tax revenues to maintain a positive balance in their unemployment trust funds. Both benefits paid out and tax revenues credited to state unemployment trust funds are reflected in the federal budget. In a given year, any increase in spending for unemployment compensation would be offset by an increase in revenues that eventually equaled about 80% of the increased spending. Thus, the net effect on the deficit over time would equal 20% of the increase in unemployment compensation. Increases in revenue would occur several years later than in increases in spending, so the deficit effect from 2021 to 2031 will be larger than the total eventual effect. The effects on revenue are included in the revenue totals discussed below. Okay. Effects and spending for Social Security. Spending in Social Security would rise with a higher minimum wage, mainly because increases in average benefits. Average benefits would increase in part because initial benefits are indexed by economy-wide average wages, which would be boosted by a higher minimum wage. Average benefits would also increase because raising the minimum wage would increase inflation, and CBO's assessment, which would be turn boost annual cost of living increases in Social Security benefits. The minimum wage increase would also affect Social Security spending in less significant ways. The reduction in unemployment resulting from a minimum wage increase, for example, would induce some workers with serious health conditions to claim disability benefits and some older workers to claim retirement benefits earlier than they would have otherwise. Social Security includes both kinds of benefits. However, increases in earnings among low-wage workers would lead some people who would otherwise have claimed Social Security benefits to delay claiming them. Also, higher earnings would exert downward pressure on Social Security spending because some claimants' benefits are reduced when their earnings increase. Spending on two Social Security trust funds, an Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund and Disability Insurance Trust Fund, is categorized as off budget, as are the program's revenues, which are discussed below, because those budgetary accounts are designed by law as excluded from the budget totals for certain purposes. Effects in spending for nutrition programs. The spending of supplement nutrition assistant programs and child nutrition programs would decline on net because increases in income for low-income households would reduce both the number of beneficiaries and their average benefit amount. Those effects would partially offset under the bill by increases in enrollment stemming from reduction in employment by increases in price indexes used to calculate benefit amounts. Probably more information is needed there. Effects on mandatory spending. Other mandatory spending would be affected in a variety of ways. Such spending is generally governed by statutory criteria and is not normally constrained by annual appropriation process. Spending would be affected by refundable tax credits, student loans, supplement security and income (SSI), various retirement programs, certain programs for veterans, and postal service, which is categorized as off budget. High labor earnings among low-wage workers would increase spending on refundable portion of the earned income tax credit and have effects on revenues, which are discussed in the next section. Those higher labor earnings would also reduce net spending on student loans by increasing the amounts repaid by borrowers enrolled in income-driven repayment plans. The increase in inflation resulting from a higher minimum wage would result in larger cost of living increases for benefits in various programs, including retirement programs, veteran programs, and SSI. For SSI, the increase would be partially offset by the effects of a boost to the average earnings of working SSI recipients, which would either lower their benefits or make them ineligible for benefits. Effects on revenues. The bill would increase revenues on net from 2021 to 2031. The net effect would be the result of a number of factors that worked in opposite directions. Although total and nominal income would be roughly unchanged by CBO's estimate, labor income would increase while capital income would decrease. Labor income tends to be more heavily taxed. Income would be shifted towards lower income people and away from higher income people under the bill. Revenues for payroll taxes for Social Security, which are categorized as off budget, would increase. Other revenues would decline on net because lower income people face lower tax rates on average than higher income people do. Several factors would tend to increase revenues. Higher labor earnings among low-wage workers are one. Those higher earnings would be subject to payroll taxes and individual income taxes and would reduce the net amount of refundable credits, such as earned income tax credit. In addition, revenues would raise in response to increased spending on unemployment insurance. As states increase their tax revenues to maintain a positive balance in their unemployment trust funds, as this report discusses above. Also, a higher economy-wide average wage would cause revenues to increase by raising the earnings threshold below which workers owe Social Security taxes. Other factors would tend to decrease revenues. Higher labor costs would cause businesses' incomes to be lower under the bill than under current law. That would reduce revenues for individuals and corporate income taxes. In addition, higher inflation would cause revenues to decline because certain aspects of the individual income tax, such as the tax brackets and standard deduction amounts, are adjusted for inflation. Revenues would also fall because large premium tax credits, as this report discusses below. Effects on discretionary outlays and wages of federal workers. The CBO estimates that discretionary. I'm gonna butcher that word every time. Outlays would increase under the bill, provided that the necessary amounts were appropriated, because a smaller number of federal workers would see a pay increase under the bill. That estimate is based on the information from the Office of Personnel Management. Using information from the Postal Service, CBO also estimates that a smaller number of postal workers would see a pay increase under the bill. Unlike spending for wages of other federal workers, such as spending for postal workers is not discretionary and is shown in Table 2 under mandatory outlays. Effects in net spending for interest. A higher minimum wage would increase net spending for interest because interest rates would increase slightly under the bill, and CBO's assessment and inflation would change. Net spending for interest largely depends on interest rates and the amount of debt that the Treasury issues to the public. The effect of the bill on the deficit that is shown in Table 2 does not include increases in net outlays for interest on federal debt, as projected under current law. That would stem from estimated changes to interest rates and inflation under the bill. Uncertainty surrounding the budgetary estimates. The effects of the Raise the Wage Act of 2021 on the budget and other outcomes are uncertain, and there is a wide range of possible outcomes of either side of the estimates shown in this report. For example, the effects depend on how quickly wages would grow in the absence of policy and how employment would respond to higher wages. If wage growth in the absence of policy proves slower than the CBO currently projects in its baseline projections, the bill effects on the employment would be larger, and the bill would probably increase the deficit by a larger amount. CBO's baseline projections incorporate the assumption that current laws generally do not change. If wage growth in the absence of policy proved faster than CBO currently projects, the opposite would be the case. To take example, if employment proved less responsive to higher minimum wage than CBO projects, a larger than projected number of people would be lifted out of poverty, which would tend to reduce spending on programs that provide services or benefits to them. If more people were employed than CBO projects, total wages of affected workers would be higher than CBO estimates, which would tend to increase spending affected by prices of goods and services they produce. How the CBO's analysis of budgetary effects has changed. In April 2019, CBO produced a cost estimate for H.R. 582, the Raise the Wage Act as reported by the House Committee on Education and Labor on March 6, 2019. The policy specifications in that bill differ somewhat from the specifications in the Raise the Wage Act of 2021. Under the assumptions about dates and enactment that CBO used, the minimum wage would reach $15 per hour in 2025 under either bill. The step increases towards the new minimum wage would have started on January 1st, 2020 under the 2019 bill, but they start on June 1st, 2021 under the 2021 bill. The step increases in the 2021 bill are thus larger and would reach 15 per hour more quickly. At the time of its April 2019 estimate, CBO's most recent economic forecast had been released in January 2019. Earlier this month, CBO released the economic forecast that underlines both the baseline budget projections used in this report and the report's estimates of the effects of Raise the Wage Act of 2021. That forecast reflects the current state of the economy and includes the impact of the 2020-2021 coronavirus pandemic is projected to have on the economy. The April 2019 estimate included only the effects of raising the pay of federal employees whose wages would be below the new minimum. CBO estimated that those increases in pay would have led to $76 million increase in discretionary outlays over the 2019 to 2029 period, subjected to appropriation of the necessary amounts. That estimate did not include budgetary impacts stemming from any behavioral effects by firms or individuals. The estimates in this report include behavioral effects on the budget in a broad set of federal programs and in revenues. Over the past 2 years, CBO has developed the capacity to analyze such behavioral effects for minimum wage legislation. Increasing the minimum wage induces a number of behaviors among businesses and people that result in changes in relative prices, the distribution of income, unemployment, and other economic factors. CBO has incorporated those effects in this estimate because the analytical approach is ready for use, is more comprehensive, and provides a consistent basis for estimates during this Congress as it considers legislation that would change the minimum wage. In this report, CBO used a customary process for estimating the budgetary effects of a legislative proposal. For example, the agency examined how eligibility for subsidies for health insurance coverage would be affected by the bill and estimated that the resulting effects on the budget. To estimate the effects on various types of revenues stemming from changes in the distribution of income, CBO used its micro-simulation tax model. CBO included behavioral effects, such as changes in the likelihood that people would claim a government benefit or changes in subsidies for health insurance resulting from changes in the prices of healthcare. That it has included in the past cost estimates of other types of legislation. The set effects incorporated in this estimate is more extensive than the set incorporated in most cost estimates. And that is because the effects on economic behavior that would affect the federal budget would be broader for minimum wage increases than in most policies the CBO examines. Behavioral effects stemming from increases in minimum wage were not included in the April 2029 estimate because those effects were complex and would have required further analysis, as CBO explained at that time. Effects on employment. Increasing the minimum wage would affect employment in several ways. Higher wages would increase the cost of employers for producing goods and services. Employers would pass some of those increased costs on to consumers in the form of higher prices, and those higher prices in turn would lead to customers to purchase fewer goods and services. Employers would consequently produce fewer goods and services, and as a result, they would tend to reduce their unemployment of workers at all wage levels. When cost of employing low-wage workers goes up, the relative cost of employing high-wage workers or investing in machines and technology goes down. Some employers would therefore respond to higher minimum wage by shifting towards those substitutes and reducing their employment of low-wage workers. In some limited circumstances, increasing the minimum wage would boost employment if employers had what is known as monosponsi power, that is, bargaining power that allows them to set wages below the rates that would prevail in a more competitive market. Because increasing the minimum wage would shift income towards families with lower income, it would boost overall demand in the short term. Lower income families spend a large proportion of any additional income on goods and services than do families with higher income. That increased demands for goods and services would reduce the drop in employment by several years after implementation of higher minimum wage, CBO projects. Taking those factors into account, CBO projects that, on net, the Raise the Wage Act of 2021 will reduce employment by increasing amounts over 2021 to 2025 period. In 2025, when the minimum wage would reach $15 per hour, employment would be reduced by 1.4 million workers, or 0.9%. According to CBO's average estimate. In 2021, most workers who would have a job because of the higher minimum wage would still be looking for work and hence be categorized as unemployed. By 2025, however, half of the 1.4 million people who would be jobless because of the bill would have been dropped out of the labor force. CBO estimates. Young, less educated people would account for the disproportionate share of those reductions in employment. This report focuses on the average or mean estimated change in employment because that measure captures the different effects of upward and downward variations from CBO's baseline projections. In particular, the growth of wages in CBO's baseline projections is uncertain, and the budgetary effects in this analysis depend on whether the hourly wages of affected workers would otherwise have been below or near the new minimum wage. The effects are asymmetric. That is, they would not be the same size if wage growth was faster than in the baseline projections or equally slower than in the baseline projections, because the effects differ when wages rise above the minimum wage. In addition, the responsiveness of employment to changes in the minimum wage is uncertain, and that uncertainty is also asymmetric. According to the agency's assessment of the research literature, responsiveness is unlikely to be much lower than CBO's median estimate, which is equally likely to be too high or too low, but could be much higher. CBO has formed distributions of values of both wage growth and responsiveness. To generate an average estimate, CBO simulated a distribution of possible changes in employment by drawing randomly from these distributions. The average estimate is weighted average of the possible employment outcomes in the simulation, which each outcome assigned a weight on the basis of the probability that it occurs. Those probabilities reflect the different effects of the upward and downward variations from CBO's baseline projections. For 2025, the average estimate that is employment would be reduced by 1.4 million workers. The median estimate is 1.0 million workers. The mean exceeded the median in this case because there is a significant possibility of large reductions in employment. CBO estimates that there is 1/3 chance that the effects being between 0 and 1 million workers, and a 1/3 chance of being between 1.0 million and 2.7 million workers. Effects on wages of affected workers. CBO estimated the amount by which labor costs for firms would change because of wages paid to people directly or potentially affected by an increase in the minimum wage. That is, people who would otherwise have been paid hourly wages that were less than the proposed new minimums or only slightly above them. Specifically, for 2021 to 2031, cumulative pay would increase by $509 billion for people who were employed at higher hourly wages under the bill. Pay would decline by $175 billion because employment would be reduced in that period under the bill. Therefore, the cumulative pay of directly and potentially affected workers would increase on net by $333 billion. CBO also estimated the number of affected workers who would experience those changes in pay. If the Raise the Wage Act of 2021 is not enacted, 17 million workers, or 10% of the labor force, as is projected under the current law, will have wages below the minimums proposed by the bill, as CBO estimates during an average week in 2025. That is therefore the number of workers who would be directly affected by the bill. Also, 10 million workers during that average week will have wages that are only slightly higher than the proposed minimums. That is the number who would be potentially affected. If the bill was enacted and the minimum wage rose, wages of many of those workers would increase as employers sought to retain some of the differences in pay that had previously existed among those workers. Effects on the distribution of family income. The net effect of the Raise the Wage Act of 2021 on income would vary considerably among families. In 2025, 0.9 million fewer people would have income below the federal poverty thresholds. CBO estimates families' real income would change in three main ways. For families with workers earning wages at or near the federal minimum, real income would increase. The effect would be concentrated at the lowest quintile, or fifth, of the distribution of family income. For families that lost employment because of the increase in the minimum wage, real income would fall. That effect would also be concentrated at the lowest quintile of the income distribution, but it would be smaller than the increase in the real income just described. For families that experienced a decline in business income or saw no change in their labor income but faced higher prices for goods and services, real income would fall. That effect would be concentrated by the highest quintile of income distribution. Effects on real output. Raising the minimum wage would slightly reduce the real GDP, primarily because of the reduced employment. However, CBO incorporated the assumption that the bill would not change nominal GDP from the amounts in the agency's baseline budget projections, following a practice that is conventional for its cost estimates. As the new section describes, CBO's estimates of the effects of the bill on the GDP price index and other price indexes were adjusted by consistent with that assumption. In addition to its effects on real output through employment, the bill would cause a stock of capital goods to be smaller than that would be otherwise. Capital goods are assets that businesses use to produce goods and services. They include tools, buildings, vehicles, machinery, and equipment. Some businesses would invest in capital goods to replace workers. Other businesses, however, would be discouraged from constructing new buildings or buying new machines if they anticipated having fewer employees to use them. On average, over 2021 to 2031 period, real investment will be slightly lower than it would be if current laws did not change. CBO estimates the reduction in investment would reduce workers' productivity and lead to further reductions in their employment. The higher minimum wage would also shift income towards lower income families, which tend to spend a relatively large fraction of their income. As a result, the total demand for goods and services would increase for several years, boosting overall real output. After that initial boost, however, CBO expects that the economic effects from increases in demand would disappear. Effects on prices. In CBO's estimate, the Raise the Wage Act of 2021 would change the relative prices of goods and services. The largest prices increases relative to the average increase would be for goods and services whose production required a larger than average share of low wage work, such as prepared and restaurants. For goods and services that use less low wage labor, in their supply chains, prices would rise less. CBO made adjustments to the projected levels of price indexes under the bill to incorporate the assumption that nominal GDP would be unchanged. If CBO had relaxed that assumption and allowed nominal GDP to change, the resulting budgetary effects would have been similar to those presented in this report. Also, if nominal GDP were allowed to change, inflation under the bill would return by 2029 to essentially the rate in CBO's baseline projections, although the level of prices would be higher than in the baseline projection. Effects on distribution of labor and capital income. Because CBO incorporated the assumption that the bill would not change nominal GDP from the amounts in the agency's baseline projections, total nominal income would be roughly unchanged. However, the share of total income derived from labor would rise on net, and the share derived from capital would fall. Labor increases would increase under the bill primarily because most people who would have earned wages at or near federal minimum under current law would receive higher labor income. However, some people would have been employed under current law would be jobless under the bill, at least for a while, and their annual labor income would be lower. Capital income would fall under the bill because higher labor costs and reduced productivity of capital. For example, corporate profits would be lower, reducing dividend income. Other types of non-wage personal income, such as proprietor's income, would also decline. Effects on interest rates. In CBO's assessment, the Raise the Wage Act of 2021 would cause interest rates to be slightly higher than they would have been otherwise over the 2021 to 2031 period. CBO expects that from 2021 to 2023, regardless of whether the bill is enacted, the real GDP would remain below its potential, that is, its maximum sustainable level. And interest rates on securities with short-term maturities would remain near zero. The agency expects that those interest rates would increase very slightly for a few years after 2023 under the bill because of the increase in inflation stemming from the raising minimum wage. The rates on securities with longer-term maturities would also respond slightly. Because those rates depend on expected future rates on securities with shorter terms, they would change sooner than the rates on those short-term securities. For example, the interest rate on a 10-year Treasury notes would rise before 2024 because it would reflect the anticipated rates on the Treasury bills issued in 2024 or later. CBO's economic modeling approach. In July 2019, CBO analyzed how various options for increasing the federal minimum wage, including a $15 option based on the version of the Raise the Wage Act reported in the House of Representatives earlier that year, would affect employment and family income. To estimate the budgetary effects of the Raise the Wage Act of 2021, CBO started with the analysis of unemployment and the distribution of income underlying its July 2019 report, shifting it forward to cover the 2021 to 2031 period and updating it to account for changes in state laws. The agency also accounted for the larger rate of economic variables. Under real GDP, relative prices, the distribution of labor and capital income, and interest rates. CBO used its estimates of the bill's effects on those factors to estimate changes in federal spending and revenues. In its 2019 report, CBO projected effects on employment and family income partly on the basis of a review of research on the responsiveness of employment to change in the minimum wage. In updating that analysis for this report, CBO reviewed recent research on how minimum wages affect employment, also to account for declines in employment caused by the 2020-2021 coronavirus pandemic. The agency reviewed the studies, asserting whether those effects would be different during a period of high unemployment. Although the pandemic and associated increases in unemployment affected CBO's baseline projections of the budget and economy for the 2021 to 2031 period, they did not lead the agency to change its general approach to estimating how employment would respond to higher minimum wage for several reasons. Under the Raise the Wage Act of 2021, the minimum wage would increase incrementally, reaching $15 per hour in 2025. The CBO's current baseline economic projections employment in 2025 is near the level that it was in the baseline projections underlying the 2019 report. Only a limited number of empirical studies have considered whether employment responds differently to a higher minimum wage during a period of high unemployment, and those studies have yielded inconclusive results. Similarly, economic models yield conflicting conclusions. Some researchers have suggested that during and after periods of high unemployment, the larger than average share of firms open and go out of business, and employment might be more responsive to a higher minimum wage under such conditions. But it is also possible that many of the workers who in normal times would be projected to lose their jobs because of higher minimum wage, such as restaurant workers, have already lost their jobs because of the pandemic. In that case, the bills enacted on unemployment could be weaker. To assess the effects on the Raise the Wage Act of 2021 on economic behavior of individuals and firms, CBO used many of its standard methods of fiscal policy analysis. Those methods incorporate different economic responses when the economy is weak, as it is currently, than when the economy is strong. CBO adjusted the GDP price index so as to hold nominal GDP unchanged from its levels in CBO's baseline projections, an assumption consistent with the agency's conventional approach to estimating the cost of legislation. Thus, the estimates reflect effects on real economic behavior. To project short-term effects on the demand of goods and services, the agency translated estimated changes in labor caused by an income in minimum wage into changes in real purchases, using estimates of the fraction of additional income spent by households across the income distribution. CBO also used its estimates of effects on unemployment and wages to project effects on capital accumulation. Specifically, CBO used dynamic general equilibrium model in which minimum wage workers, other workers, and technology, such as machinery, are imperfect substitutes for one another. The dynamic general equilibrium model is one of which households and businesses interact with each other in markets for goods and capital, responding to prices, such as wages and the rates of return on saving, that are themselves determined by those interactions. Using that model, the agency examined how changes in labor income and profits stemming from an increase in the minimum wage would affect capital accumulation and business income. To project the effects on relative prices, CBO estimated changes in labor costs for different industries and translated them into changes in the prices of goods and services, accounting for industries' dependence on each other. A given industry's product uses other industries' products as inputs, and the price of the industry's product, therefore, reflects not only the cost of labor in that industry, but also the cost and labor of other industries. How are we doing in time, as far as time? Page of this? Okay. Thanks for you guys sitting through, watching me attempt to read. Almost there. Comparison with CBO's July 2019 analysis. Okay. CBO's July 2019 report about an earlier version of the Raise the Wage Act included estimates of how economic behavior by individual firms would change as a result of the bill. It also included the correlative discussion of how these changes in economic behavior would affect the budget, but it did not present quantitative estimates of those budgetary effects. The results in this report differ from those in the July 2019 report, and there are several reasons for differences. First, the distribution of hourly wages in 2025 and the CBO's current baseline projections differ from that distribution of the agency's 2029 baseline projections. That difference arises partly because CBO projects that the pandemic will depress wages through 2025, and partially because the passage of Florida's ballot initiative 2 will raise the state minimum wage in Florida on an incremental basis to $15 per hour by 2026. The Florida law reduces the number of workers who in 2025 would be sequentially affected by the Raise the Wage Act of 2021. Second, the timeline of the policy's implementation ran from January 2020 to January 1st, 2025 in the 2019 report. But it runs from June 1st, 2021 to June 1st, 2025 in this report. In this report, therefore, firms have less time to adjust to the policy's implementation than they did under the policy analyzed in the earlier report. That difference matters because the employment of low-wage workers is more responsive to higher minimum wages than firms that have more time to respond to the higher costs. Third, to capture different effects of the upward and downward variations from its baseline projections, as this report discussed below, CBO focuses here on mean outcomes of its simulations rather than on an estimate calculated by using the median values of key inputs, specifically projected wage growth and the responsiveness of employment to changes in the minimum wage. Using the mean outcome results is larger central estimates of reductions in employment and real output. Taken together, those differences lead to differences in the report's projected effects on employment and family income. In the 2019 report, CBO estimated that the employment would fall by 1.3 million workers by 2025. In this report, its estimated reduction is 1.4 million workers. The most important analytical change that led to this difference was the CBO's use of the mean rather than the median in determining its central estimates. The distribution of possible employment effects is asymmetric, and the mean is greater than the median. If CBO had used the median values of key inputs, as it did in the 2019 report, the central estimate of employment effect in 2025 would be a reduction of 1.1 million workers, a smaller amount than in the 2019 report. The estimated number of people whose annual income would rise above the federal poverty thresholds in 2025 is smaller in the current report, 0.9 million, than it was in the 2019 report, 1.3 million. The difference stems from the changes in the CBO's baseline projections, from the changes in the policy's timelines, and from the use of the mean outcomes rather than the outcomes generated by median values and key inputs. Okay. The Congressional Budget Office report was prepared in response to a request by the chairman of the Senate Committee on Budget. In keeping with CBO's mandate to provide objective, empirical analysis, the report contains no recommendations. Okay. Nabel Aslam, William Carrington, Justin Falk, and Brooke Prices prepared the report with the assistance of Julia Henzel and the guidance of Molly Dow, Joseph Kai, Zuntong Niu. Estimates on economic and budgetary effects were prepared by Susan Yi Breyer, Yiquin Gloria Chen, Chad Chiraco, Shayla Dacey, Meredith Decker, Devrim Demeril, Nathan Frentz, Edward Gamber, Jennifer Gray, Cornelia Hall, Edward Harris, Lori Hausman, Justin Humphrey, Nadia Koncheva, Brian Q, Leah Koster, James E. Kowalczyk, formerly of CBO, Justin Lattis, Hugh John Lee, Avi Lerner, Sarah Massey, Noah Mayerson, Alexandra Minicozy, Eamon Molly, Hudson Osgood, James Otterson, Allison Percy, Jeffrey Perry, Stephanie Rambent, Dan Reedy, Sarah Sadrisky, Jeffrey Schaefer, Kurt Siebert, John Zelinsky, Joshua Sankin, Navin Sinjhal, Emily Stern, Robert Stewart, and Emily Vreeland. Helpful comments were received by Leah Angers, Christina Howley, Anthony Sheila Dacey, Wendy Edelberg, formerly of CBO, Heidi Golding, Teresa Gullo, Deborah Kilrow, Paul Massey, John McClelland, Amy Poppenfuss, Julie Topoleski, and Jeffrey Whirling. Gregory Arks of the Urban Institute, Jeffrey Clemens of the University of California, San Diego, and Isabel Sawil of Brookings Institution also provided helpful comments in some of the analytical methods. Assistants and internal reviewers implies no responsibility of the final product, which rests solely with CBO. Mark Doms, Mark Hadley, Jeffrey King, Robert Sunshine reviewed the report, and Christy Bowery and Benjamin Poltiski edited it. This report is available on the agency's website, www.cbo.gov/publications/56975. The CBO continually seeks feedback to make its work as useful as possible. Please send any comments to communications@cbo.gov. Signed, Philip Sweegel, Director. Page 15 is the federal minimum wage under S53, Raise the Wage Act. So, federal minimum wage, June 1st, 2021, $9.50. 2022, $11. 2023, $12.05. 2024, 14, 2025, 15, 2026, 15, plus indexing adjustment. On page 16, these are different charts. It's showing us the estimated budgetary effects. I am not going to attempt to read these numbers line by line and year by year. I will, however, post this in chat. And this was the things that they described as terms of like looking at the charts below. And a bunch of just side notes and citations within each of the charts. And that is that. That is the budgetary effects of the Raise the Wage Act of 2021, published February 2021 by the Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan analysis for the U.S. Congress. With that, that's all we're doing tonight. Like I said, Mondays and Thursdays now are going to be sort of off days, but I'm going to spend those days doing reads of certain things to help inform you guys in just whatever's going on in the main zeitgeist. So that's why we read the budgetary effects of the Raise the Wage Act of 2021. With that being said, I'm going to send you over to Prime Guys. How many who are in here right now as we sat through this? But yeah, so again, these are off days. They're pretty slow. But with that being said, have a good night. And I'll see you in the full True Stream schedule on Tuesday.